The Israelites, they're in captivity in Egypt. Moses and Aaron roll in. They say, hey, God has commissioned us to tell you that you need to let all of those people go. You need to let them all go, let them free. They're no longer slaves. God wants to free them. And the Pharaoh of Egypt really was like, you know what? Who's this God that you talk about? I have hundreds of gods that I serve, but who is your God? And I talked 2 weeks ago about how there's these different plagues of Israel that happen to prove like this is it. And if you remember, Pharaoh would be like, oh yeah, cool. You can let, yeah, they can go. And then all of a sudden he'd be like, nah, never mind. And then something else would happen and the river would turn to blood. And he'd be like, hey, okay, you can go ahead and let the people go. And then he'd change his mind. And I don't know if you have friends like this. Do you ever have friends that change their mind all the time? They're like, yes, and then they mean no, but they mean no, and then they say yes, and then they say maybe, and you really don't know what they mean. And they're like, oh, you know what maybe means? You're like, nah, I really don't know what maybe means. We all have people like that. And so we have this back and forth that we talked about the 3 plagues that hit and all these things that had happened. And so we're going to actually pick up where we left off because we have a few more plagues to happen. Now, when we think of the word plague, and we talk about this word, we kind of have, we know what a plague is something that is not good. We've never heard anyone say, oh yeah, I love that plague that just happened. Well, no, like a plague is something that causes devastation, that comes through, and that really is bad. It's something that happens, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but in this time when these things began to happen, it wasn't like they happened all of the time. All right, so we live in central Pennsylvania. We live in an area. What if all of a sudden the water just turned to blood? Like that wouldn't be a normal everyday thing. That wouldn't be something that happens all the time, that it would just happen. If all of a sudden frogs just were everywhere, that's not a normal thing. If all of a sudden we had, sick cattle and there was boils on the skin and there was fire and hail and darkness and all of these things, these weren't normal things. So what you have to understand about the miracles that happened, they were miraculous. They were miraculous, meaning that there's no way that it could happen unless it was a miracle. That God allowed these things to happen. And so when we're talking about these plagues and we're talking about God proving himself to Pharaoh to say, listen, like I am the God above all gods. I am the God who is in control of everything. They were miracles performed by God for a specific time and a specific purpose. So you got to understand when you want to know who God is, God will speak to you in a specific time for a specific purpose, saying this is who I am. And so we have these plagues that had happened, and understand this, that they weren't just happening because God was mean. They weren't just happening because God is a bad God. They were happening because they were meaningful in what happened to happen. Because Egypt was worshiping false gods. So he said, listen, I'm going to prove to you that I am the God. I'm a jealous God. You should only love me. God says that. He said, the only thing you should ever be jealous of is me, because I'm the God that you should serve. God used the plagues to reveal himself and make himself known. Like if all this stuff started happening and all these things, like all of these plagues started happening, we wouldn't be like, this person did it or that person did it. We'd be like, okay, God, what is going on? Because sometimes when miracles and when things happen that are supernatural and things come out of nowhere, the only reason that it could ever happen is because of God. A lot of different theories. Some people would say evolution. Some people would say this, some people that. But sometimes, can I just be honest with you? Sometimes it's just God. Sometimes it's just what God does. And so we got to understand that he was trying to demonstrate that, listen, you can't worship false gods. He was also trying to demonstrate how powerful he was. But God was also demonstrating that, listen, when you disobey me, there are consequences. When you go against me, there are consequences. When you don't serve me and then you play games with me back and forth, there will be consequences to the actions and things that happen. God demonstrates to us that sins have consequences. They do. They have consequences. Just like the natural law of if I do something, there's going to be a positive or negative reaction to what I do. That's how it is with God. God says, listen, you can obey me or you can disobey me, but you have to deal with the consequences of what happens. So we got to understand that these plagues that were happening, they were miraculous, meaning that there's no other way that could happen. They were meaningful, so they had a purpose, but they also revealed the mercy of God. And you might say, okay, like, how does the plagues reveal the mercy of God? It was a warning saying, God would say, listen, like this, you got to know what's going on. Like, I'm being merciful to you. I'm not just wiping you out. Because if God wanted to, he could have wiped out all of Egypt. But he was giving Pharaoh an opportunity to turn himself around, to recognize who he was. He was saying, hey, listen, I want you to understand who I am. He's worked wonders in my lives, and he's worked wonders in your lives. The fact that you're here tonight by your own will is a miracle of God. I want you to understand that. The fact that you choose to come here and listen about God and to God is a miracle in itself. And so God reveals himself to us all the time, and this is a way that God does. By when you hear the word of God and you hear the purpose of God, he's revealing himself saying, listen, I got something that I want to teach you. But God said, listen, I'm going to teach you what happens when you are disobedient to me. Now, I don't know about you, but there are times when I was a kid, I was very disobedient to my parents. And there were times where I'll be honest that I didn't mean to be disobedient. It just kind of happened. You know what I'm saying? Like some of you are shaking your head. You know exactly what, like you didn't mean to be disobedient. It just kind of happened and you did it. But then there are times where I was like absolutely 100% disobedient on purpose. Like if I was traveling and my older sister and I were in the back seat and my mom or dad would say to me, if you hit your sister one more time, you will be grounded for a week. Now see, all of a sudden I begin to think, is a week worth it? Is a week worth it? If I were to hit my sister, I think I can handle a week, and whap, I'd hit her one more time and then I'd be grounded. I willingly disobeyed, and so I had to face the consequence. See, when Pharaoh willingly disobeyed God to not let the people go and to keep them in slavery, when he willingly said, now, you know what, I'm not going to do this, he went against what God had done. All of these plagues were for one purpose, to get his attention. Because you understand, Pharaoh was the ruler of Egypt. He was the ruler. He had the power to let he had the power over Egypt. He even had the power over Israel. He had the power to say, you know what, let them go and they could be gone. He had the power to say, kill them all, and they could have all been killed. Pharaoh had the power, but what God was saying, listen, I'm trying to get your attention. A few years ago, I preached a message on talking about getting God's attention. Sometimes in life, it's about God getting our attention. Sometimes things happen in life and God says, listen, I'm trying to get your attention. I'm trying to get you to pay attention to what I have for you. And this is what he was doing in Egypt. He was saying, listen, I'm trying to get you to understand that I have something in store for you to get your act together. What will it take to get your attention? I want you to think about this. Just for one moment, if everyone can just look at me for one moment. I have a question. What will it take for God to get your attention? What is it going to take for God to say, hey, you know what? Let's have this relationship. Let's do this. Let's be committed. What is it going to take to get your attention? And I want you to think about that question for the remainder of this sermon tonight. What does it take for God to get your attention? The fact that Jesus already died for us should get our undivided attention. But oftentimes we forget that and we take that for granted. I want to go through just some of the plagues that had happened. And if you remember the rest of these plagues, for every plague that happened, God kind of slapped Egypt in the face because they had a God that represented the plague that had happened. So we talked about there is a God of the frogs, there is a God of the harvest, there's a God of the water, of the Nile River. And every time God kind of messed with Egypt, he was kind of poking at their false god they worshiped. The fourth plague that really had happened and that came forth was actually a plague of just basic flies. You ever been outside at a picnic and flies start flying around and you're swatting them all over the place? Well, imagine having so many flies that you can't even see. Imagine there being so many flies that you can't even focus, that you can't even see through. It said that there were swarms of flies that you may know that I am the Lord. And so there were so many flies that you couldn't even see. If you think about one little fly, how it drives you crazy. I talked about this 2 weeks ago. I'll be sitting in my office and it'll be nice and calm and all of a sudden I hear, bzzz. I'm about to freak out. All right? I start going nuts. Like I will find whatever I can. Let me tell you a funny story. When I was in second grade, all right? Second grade, long time ago. Second grade. I was in Mrs. Kelly's class. In Mrs. Kelly's class, we took a field trip that day, all right? We took a field trip, and we went to this this place called, if I can remember, it was called like a colony village, or it was a place that was set up like the Pilgrims, all right? But it was all historical landmarks. Everything was historical that was there, all right? So everything was very, very old, and it was like protected by the Historical Society, all that stuff. It was a part of Pennsylvania that they have kind of kept up throughout the years. Well, I am in one of the little cabins that are like hundreds of years old, all right? And I'm in second grade. But all of a sudden, a bee flies into the room, starts buzzing around everywhere. So naturally, I'm like, I'm getting this bee. I'm not paying attention to the moderator that's talking about how old the colony is or the house or the historical value of everything in there. But I'm totally not paying attention. I'm just like following the bee everywhere. So I get the bright idea to take off my shoe. I said, I'm going to get this bee. But this bee. As I watch the bee, it kind of flies around a few people. I'm thinking, well, I can't swat it now because I can't hit a person with my shoe. But all of a sudden, it lands on this window. All right? Remember, this is a historical society. Everything's protected. All right? Lands on the window. Game on. I was like, I know I got good aim. I know I can smash this bee. So I take my shoe and I go and I take it, I swing. I swing like no one's swung before. I went as hard as I can. And the bee moved and I shattered the window. Shattered the window in second grade. All of a sudden it was like, bzz, whoosh. I was like, and the bee flew out the window. Little freaking bugger flew right away. But I smashed a window at a historical landmark in second grade. That's how much these little flying insects irritate me. But imagine having that many flies everywhere around you when you're trying to do anything. Trying to do schoolwork, there's flies. You're trying to eat, there's flies. You're trying to watch Netflix, there's flies. There are flies everywhere, flying around all over the place. So we have to understand that this was the first time, though, that God actually separated Israel from the plagues that affected Egypt. Because he said, listen, your people, this is going to affect your people, Pharaoh. Because of your actions, because of the ignorance that you have, this will affect your people. So that's like, oh, if we're all hanging out and you're Egyptian and I'm not, all of a sudden you got flies around you all the time and I don't. That's how life was there. It was affecting those people. But we need to see a new development here in verse 25 and 32. Pharaoh begins to find ways to appease God's wrath without totally obeying him. I've said this before, and I'll say it again probably till the day I die. Partial obedience is still disobedience. I want you to understand that. Partial obedience is still disobedience. I'm either going to obey God or I'm not. There's no half in and half out. Like you either do this or you don't. But Pharaoh, you know what? Hey, maybe I can convince Moses and Aaron to make a sacrifice to their God, and then I'll let them go. But I'm not going to let them go very far. See, Pharaoh was like, I'm going to start to play games with God. Like, I think I'll let him go. No, I'm not going to. Hey, Moses, if you can get rid of all these flies for me and get rid of all of these things, like that would be absolutely awesome. But he didn't. So finally Moses gets fed up. He's like, dude, you keep playing games with me and I'm sick of it. Like, quit playing games with God, quit playing games with me. And it says that he finally said, Moses warned Pharaoh, don't try to cheat God again by not letting the people go. Once again, Moses prayed to God and the plague was removed. And once again, Pharaoh said, no, I'm good. I'm going to keep everybody. But then the verse says, and once again, Pharaoh hardened his heart. So we have to understand that Pharaoh hardened his heart this time, and each time something happens. So let's review real quick. I want you to imagine living in Egypt. Imagine living this. Okay, so first of all, you had the Nile River became blood. Then you had the land smelling like frogs because they were everywhere and they died. Then you had annoying gnats everywhere flying around. Then you had annoying flies everywhere flying around, and all this stuff was going on. See, probably the frogs would have did it for me. I'd have been like, yep, take the people, go, get out of here. But this is what Pharaoh was. So you had the blood, you had this, you had that, all these different things, and he was like, no, I'm still not going to let him go. So he said, all right, fine, if you're going to act this way, we got one more for you. The death of all of the livestock. It said, behold, the hand of the Lord will fall on a very severe plague upon your livestock, meaning all of their oxen and cows and any of the living animals that helped aid them in life. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord made a very distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing that belonged to the people of Israel would die. So again, you have a separation like, okay, Pharaoh, this is you and your people. All of your animals are going to be dead. They're going to go. Now see, in modern culture, like especially where we live at, we kind of, unless you live on a farm, we don't have an appreciation for what really this would do, the trauma that this would cause. Because you got to understand, livestock was their transportation, it was their way of life, it was their commerce, their agriculture, their clothing. Like, to have your cows die meant that you could not live, you couldn't have food, you couldn't process, you couldn't farm, you couldn't do any of these things. What's really interesting, I was talking to Alexis and Thomas before, we were kind of going over this, talking about this, but in India, a number of years ago up in India, the dowry payment to get married, meaning that if I wanted to like get married to Bethany, I would have to give her family a gift. So in the Egyptian culture, in this culture in India, naturally, the best gift to give your future in-laws, it's not a diamond, it's not a bracelet, it's not cash, it's a cow. The fattest cow I could find, baby. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it to them, and I'm going to give it as a down payment to say, hey, nothing says I want to marry your daughter like a cow. But I want to marry your daughter, so I'm going to give you this cow. And you might say, okay, listen, like, why would a person want a cow instead of cash? Because you got to understand that a cow was usually more valuable than cash, because it could be used for transportation, it could be used for producing more cattle, for fuel, you know, those big, thick cow patties, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, for milk, and a cow is very valuable. So in the Egyptian culture, you have to understand that the cow was extremely valuable. The livestock, it was their way of life. And God said, all right, you want to keep playing with me? Boom, all of your livestock dead. Oh, now, I'm sure that back then they didn't have any activists, they didn't have PETA to pop up and go, well, you're killing all the animals. Like, no. Like, they're dead, they're gone, they're done. But you got to understand, that's like everything getting ripped away from you. Everything that your life dependency on these cows, everything got ripped away. We don't really understand that because we're not farmers. We don't depend on them anymore. But you got to understand that this plague, it affected the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, the sheep. And it was all of these things. And animals were essential in Egypt. Cattle especially. Because you got to understand, if I had one cow, I was considered like middle high class. If I had more than 2 cows, I was considered higher class. Isn't it funny how that works? Like, naturally here, it's all about the money. Like, if you have money, you're lower class, middle class, high class. Like back then, if you had cattle, you were high class. If you had all of the cows, like, you were the richest dude around. Like, so you got to understand that this was a symbol of wealth. None of the Hebrew livestock were harmed. Pharaoh even sent men to investigate to see if that had happened. And what this did, this actually targeted the Egyptian god whose name was Apis. And this was a sacred bull to all the Egyptians. And when Apis was well, it was considered the livestock was well. They used a bull and saying, like, understand that Egyptian culture was very, very ingrained with the animal world. God said, oh, you want to put your stock in them and not in me? Gone. So we have this plague that happened that wiped out all of these animals. Then this next one's like this is the doozy for me. Like, I would be done. I'd be totally done, because Pharaoh still, even though all this happened in his livestock, he still didn't let the people go. He's like, nah, I'm not done yet. I'm not going to do this. I haven't given in yet. So then God sends what we know today as boils. Boils. Now, some of us know what a boil is. Some of us don't know what a boil is. And so this was the next plague that directly affected the humans there. It was delivered unannounced. Moses didn't come and say, hey, everybody, you're going to have a boil. Like, no. It's like you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you're like, what is that? And that's a boil, and it begins to evolve on your skin, and it's an infection, and it's painful. The Hebrew word for boils comes from that which is hot, which irritates. I don't know if you've ever had a boil on you. Have you ever had chicken pox? Anybody ever have chicken pox? All right, I had chicken pox as a kid. Okay, have you guys ever had like a bad sore from like maybe shoes, rollerblades, ice skates, anything like that? Like, you know what I'm talking about? Okay, I want you to multiply that times like 100, set it on fire, and make it the itchiest thing that you ever had in your life. That's what a boil happened. Now, you got to understand, it wasn't like, oh, I got one boil on my skin. They were utterly infected with boils all over their body. It's like having poison ivy on fire on you, that every time you scratch, it gets worse. Every time you poke it, it gets worse. Like, this is what God said. God said, listen, I'm going to affect you directly. I don't know if you've ever had this, but these are very uncomfortable, painful, and an outbreak could cause death. A severe outbreak could be personally devastating. And you got to understand this, the plagues were getting closer and closer to the center of Egyptian life. Yet Pharaoh still refused. Because it says in chapter 9, verse 12, his heart even grew more hard. Now you got to understand that sending boils actually targeted their god named Imhotep, who was a physician god. He was worshipped by Romans and Greeks as the god of medicine, and the priests could not even heal themselves. According to the Bible, this only affected the Egyptians and the animals that they actually even had left. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get like one little itch, I get itchy when I see someone scratching. Like when I see someone like, man, I got an itch, all of a sudden I get itchy. To be in a community where everybody had these things on their skin from head to toe, I'd have been like, dude, you can like take the Israelites and go. I'm done dealing with this. I'm done dealing with all this craziness. Like, this is absolutely insane. But we read that Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, and he did not let him go. So God said, man, okay, well, if that's not going to solve it, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send hail, and I'm going to mix it with fire. I'm going to send it down. Now, we've had like hail here in Pennsylvania, but you got to understand when God says hail, it's not like okay, I'm going to send little pebbles. No, it's like softballs, okay, that are these big chunks of ice that are mixed with fire that are coming down from the sky that are hitting. And this targeted the goddess. This goddess name was Nut, N-U-T, who was the goddess of the sky. And you got to understand, this destroyed the creation around them. The Hebrews were not harmed. Even some of Pharaoh's officials heeded the warning and were like, listen, we shouldn't do this. But the weather disturbance, whenever there was a big weather change, the Egyptians believed it was a sign of the gods. Understand that. So all of a sudden, if you're chilling, it's a nice day, all of a sudden a cloud rolls in, thunder, lightning, boom. You're like, oh, the gods are up to something. Whatever culture it was, they believed that when there was a severe weather change, that the gods were unhappy with them. This is what we learned from Egyptian culture. Severe weather changes had to do with appeasing the gods and making sure that. In fact, there was an Egyptian god named Seth who was considered the god of wind and storms. And it says, therefore, it would have felt as if the sky was falling down upon them. In verse 27, Pharaoh admits that he has sinned against God. He asked Moses to have God stop the hail and let the Hebrews go, because this got so intense. Not being able to walk outside and enjoy creation, what was left of creation in Egypt, with all these things happening. And what we have this misconception that, oh, okay, so a hailstorm for a couple of minutes. Like, no, this wasn't like, these plagues didn't happen for just a couple of minutes. They happened for days and weeks. Weeks upon weeks of being like, okay, I got to go outside and hope I don't get hit by like a huge fireball from heaven. That's how the Egyptians lived. And why? Because Pharaoh would not obey God. All because of one man's hard heart, he would not obey him. So he said, all right, I got one more thing that I'm going to send at you. One more. I got two more. I got two more things I'm going to send at you, but this is going to be one that is really going to devastate you, because I've already sent gnats that fly around. I've already sent flies, but I'm not done yet, because I'm going to send locusts. Have you ever seen a locust? Number one, they are ugly, okay? Number two, they're loud and annoying. And number three, when they begin to multiply, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. Locusts are gross. That's exactly it. Locusts are gross, and they're annoying. They're absolutely annoying. But you got to understand, this targeted, again, their land. So imagine being a priest of Pharaoh, and all of these things have happened. Because the Bible says that that Pharaoh's priests begged him and pleaded with him, hey, let these people go. Let them go. Get them out of here. The locusts would have eaten whatever crops or vegetation was possibly left. Pharaoh again admitted he was wrong, agreed to let the Hebrews go, and then changed his mind after they had left. You got to understand that the locusts were destroying what was left. Whatever was left was going to be gone. His servants said, listen, we have to stop this. Let them go, that they may serve their God. But he kept saying no. But you got to understand that what happened here is you have the locusts, but you also still have the hail and the fire coming. Because now it says there's a combination of the hail and the locusts sent a strong statement to the Egyptians. Because one week you have the hail, the next week you have the locusts. So there's a strong statement saying, listen, you worship these gods of vegetation, you worship the God of the tree, you worship the God of the air. Well, guess what? I'm in control of all of those. I am the one that is in control of all these things. So Pharaoh said, oh man, okay, I'm going to repent. And so as soon as God pulled all the locusts away by driving them into the Red Sea, which we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. As soon as the pressure was off, Pharaoh refused to let the people go. He seemed to be on a path of both personal and public destruction. God clearly sent him a message, but he didn't listen. So he said, all right, I'll send another one to you. I got another plague before I directly affect you as a person. With any type, before I put my hand upon humans and touch, this is what I got for you. Darkness. How many of you are afraid of the dark? Trust me, we're all, hey, if you're afraid of the dark, that's fine. You can rate. Jeremiah's like, I'm kind of halfway. Yeah, okay. If you're afraid of the dark, it's okay, all right? The fear of the dark is a very common thing to be afraid of. Now, have you ever, been at a place where I'm talking dark, so dark, if you have your hand in front of your face this close, you can't see dark? That's how dark I'm talking. Okay, many of you been to youth camp. We go up to Camp Manawagon. If there is no lights on and there's no fire and there's nothing and the moon's not out and it's dark, it's you have a hard time. You're walking through the woods banging into trees. Because you're like, man, I gotta go to the bathroom, but I can't get there because it's so dark. Listen, this darkness was the final warning before the ultimate plague came. It was really many cultures believe that the Egyptians they had a main thing where they worshiped the light. They worshiped the sun god named Ra, and their whole premise of the Egyptian culture was based around worshiping the sun. So God said, all right, cool, you want to make that a foundation of worship? Well, I'm going to take that out. Since the sun provided light, warmth, and growth, it was an overestimate of the importance of really what had happened, because if it was warmth and light, now it's darkness and coldness. I'll tell you what, I don't like being in the dark, but I don't like being cold in the dark. There's something about being cold in the dark that just doesn't sit right with me. But God, yeah, it's scary because you can't see, you don't know what's going on, you don't know what's happening. So he said, you know what, I'm going to send a darkness. And this is how dark, verse 21, God describes this plague as a darkness to be felt. I want you to understand that. I don't know if we even know what that means. A darkness that can literally be felt. Have you ever been so scared that it wasn't I'm just scared, scared down deep into your soul and heart scared? You know what I'm talking? I don't know if you've ever been there. I have been there. I have been scared down deep within me where you feel fear. It's legitimately inside of you. He said, listen, a darkness is going to hit you that can literally, it's being felt. That's darkness. That's scary darkness. But he said, you are going to understand what it is. So naturally, for weeks upon weeks on weeks, it was darkness. It was dark. All these things have happened. But once again, Pharaoh tried to broker a deal by suggesting that the people could leave, but they had to leave their livestock behind. He wanted some kind of leverage on them. But once again, Moses said, listen, like this isn't about it. Guys, 9 times Pharaoh had been told to obey God, and he kept saying no. You had the Nile River, the frogs, the gnats, the flies, the livestock, the boils, the hails, the locusts, the darkness, all have been said to him, yet he still refused to humble himself and just acknowledge God. In arrogant anger, he said, get away from me. Take care never to come before my face again. For the day you see my face again, Moses, you shall die. Pharaoh had had enough. But his heart was still hardened. Because Pharaoh's world was falling apart around him, and he refused to listen to what God is saying to him, despite what would be so obvious. Despite what was so obvious. 9 plagues sent, and he still said no. Do you know what that tells me? I want everybody to focus tonight, because this is the whole premise of tonight. What this tells me is that God can literally affect creation. He can literally affect our inner world, and we can still have a hardened heart towards him and not acknowledge that he's God. Now, let's just be honest. You may have not had plagues that have come into your life. You didn't wake up one morning, turn on the faucet, and there's blood coming out of the faucet. You didn't wake up one morning and there's flies and gnats and darkness. Maybe that's not what you woke up to, but maybe there was something that happened in your life that was hard and difficult for you to deal with, and you had your own plague to work through. But instead of turning to God, you've hardened your heart. Instead of acknowledging God, you said, no, I'm not going to believe in him. Maybe it's something because something happened with a mom or a dad in your life. Maybe something happened with a grandma or a grandpa or a brother or a sister. Or maybe something happened where someone left you that promised that they would never leave you. See, you might not have had these 9 plagues, but you certainly have had some type of plague in your life that has directly affected you. And what you have done is you have hardened your heart against God. Saying, God, if you say you're so good, then why has this happened? God, if you say that we should worship you, why did they leave? God, you say I should worship you, why did this happen to me? See, God was trying to speak to Pharaoh. You all have your own plagues, and maybe it was a relationship that was so consuming that it was a desire for approval that made you hate people. Maybe you wanted to be liked by people so much when you were younger, or maybe you wanted to be accepted by people so much when you were younger that as you grow older and you realize that you can't, instead of liking people, you hate them. Maybe you were always confident as a kid, but as you grew up, the confidence has kind of gone away, and you just have become someone who hates who you are. We all have our own plagues that have come into our life. Maybe you were in a relationship that literally devastated you for years and is still devastating you. Maybe you're longing to be loved, but you're longing to be loved by the wrong thing. Or by the wrong person. If you look at your life, I'm sure you could find your own plague. I have mine. Dave has his. Bethany has hers. Ryan has his. Joe, the bus driver, has his. Griffin has his. We have all have our own plagues that have happened in our life. And a plague will either, one of two things, a plague will either point you to God or point you away from God. But it's still your choice in what you do when God tries to get your attention. See, when I read the story about Pharaoh and Egypt and all these plagues that have happened, I cannot help but think about ways that God has mercifully got my attention through the years. That he didn't have to do anything devastating to my life to get my attention. In light of what I see in this, I'm saying, okay, God, what is it you're saying to me? I'm to a point now where when something happens, it's not, God, I hate you. It's, okay, God, what are you trying to say? I've had situations in my life over the years where stuff has happened, and I could have gotten my heart hardened. I could have said, God, I hate you. I don't even believe in you anymore. but then I would miss what God is trying to say to me. Is God trying to get your attention tonight? Because you got to understand a few things. Number one, that God is the ultimate goal of everything. Having this relationship, the purpose of Exodus is the same purpose in creation, which is to say, listen, there's a story of redemption where Jesus loved you so much that he died for you to get you out of your mess so that you could accept him into your life and you could know who he is and spend eternity with him. God, redemption is everything. At any attempt to magnify something else to be equal to God is sin. To say that anything else is as great as God is sin, because there is nothing in life that can be given to you that is greater than the redemption that God has given to you. And when I'm talking redemption, I'm talking Jesus. Because see, Jesus was given for you. Can I be honest? You didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve it. I didn't deserve it. We didn't deserve it, but God said, listen, I'm going to give you my son Jesus, the most precious thing in the world to me, so that you can have freedom, so that you can know what it's like to live in all of this. So you got to understand, number one, that God's is the ultimate, that having redemptive power, understanding that God has rescued us is number one. Number two is realize that when goodness happens and when evil happens, when great things happen and when bad things happen, both are in our life to point us to God. Both are in our lives to point us to God. This is what Apostle Paul said. He said, the kindness of God is meant to lead me into repentance. Even the good things of God leads me to repent. In other words, all the good things we receive from God lead us to trust in him. But hardship, difficulty, problems, plagues, it has the same thing. That is meant to turn us towards God. Because what's the first thing that, when something bad happens in your life, what's the first thing that you do? You cry out to God. When you have someone that wins a championship game, what's the first thing they do? They thank God. See, it's in the goodness of God that we celebrate, but it's also in the hardships of life and humankind that we also celebrate who God is. Because both are directing us towards God. I think there's one last thing that's very imperative and important for us to understand. That we need to realize what God is saying, but we need to realize that God rescued us, that all things point to God, but you got to understand this too, that brokenness, being broken before God is where I start. Because you understand, Pharaoh refused. He refused to be broken before God. We've watched Pharaoh become more and more isolated, more and more stubborn. You almost want to, like, when I'm reading the story, I'm like, Pharaoh, I'm begging you, let the people go. You're affecting everything around you, people's lives, everything they built for. Let them go. Just realize who God is. Let him go. And I read this and I plead. I'm thinking, come on. Like, you have to understand who God is. Become broken. Lay aside your pride. And I'm sitting here and I'm yelling. And I'm getting into the story and I'm reading this. And I'm saying, come on. Come on. And I'm getting aggravated with this man who won't submit to God. And God speaks to my heart and says, are you willing to be broken? He won't. But will you? Listen, life's hard. Life's difficult. Let's just be honest. Sometimes life sucks. But there's something that makes my life better. There's something that brings hope to me when I'm in relationship with God. There's a strength that I can find deep inside of myself that God has given to me. And that's my relationship with Jesus. But it all starts with brokenness. It's the starting point. You know why we have a problem with being broken and obedient to God? Can I just be honest? You know why this is so hard for us? Because we give up control. We give up control. When we say, God, do whatever you want to do, we are letting go of being in control of ourselves. Brokenness is a weird thing. It's a hard thing. It's a thing we don't talk about anymore. It's a subject that we don't really have anything to do with. You don't hear many youth pastors or many leaders say, hey, let's talk about brokenness and what it means to just say, God, whatever you want to do it. And brokenness isn't just a one-time thing, but brokenness is a lifestyle that you live every day saying, God, whatever you want me to do. God, I accept that whatever happens in my life. God, I accept whatever situation comes about, that I'll be in a relationship with you. Brokenness isn't easy. Being broken is not an easy thing to do. It's not something that comes and says, oh, I love being broken and I love where this happens. But see, brokenness is where the relationship of God begins. I can confidently tell everyone in this room one thing. No matter how you choose to answer the question, God is trying to get your attention. Whether you believe it or not, He's trying to get your attention. He's trying to speak to you and say something to you. What is it going to take? What are you going to have to walk through to finally say, all right, God, I get it. All right, God, I understand this. Because this is what it's about. It's about saying, being broken, saying, God, whatever it is you have. We don't have time tonight to get into the last plague, the most devastating plague that happened. But I'll speak on that in a few weeks. We don't have time to get into that. But we have to understand that God is saying, listen, I want a generation to be broken. I want them confidently to come to me with whatever they need. Because you're not alone. You're not alone. God loves you. And that's what we have to understand. Is there's a point of brokenness that you get to where you're saying, okay, I'm in. I'm in completely. And I'm not saying this and not knowing this because I've had to walk through this. Bethany's had to walk through this. Ryan, other leaders, your friends that sit next to you, we all have had to walk through this. From the first devastating thing that happened in our life, we've had to walk through it. But we've never walked through it alone. God is simply saying, listen, I want the direction to come to me. I want your focus on me. Maybe it's tonight. Maybe tonight on this snowy night where we weren't sure if we were going to have youth group. We weren't sure if we were going to even come here tonight. Maybe tonight is the night where God's finally going to get your attention. Maybe tonight's the night where God's finally going to say, listen,